Hello, Vincent Carroll speaking. Tutorial number 17, arthritis from an acupuncture point of view. Many people come with various bony conditions for acupuncture treatment, and certainly from my point of view, the most important thing to decide is whether there is heat or whether there is cold, whether the condition is a hot condition or a cold condition, because from a Western medical point of view, very many arthropathies are the result of inflammatory disease. The typical example might be rheumatoid arthritis. Ankylosing spondylitis, for example, would be another common inflammatory disease of bone. But then there's also the wear and tear issues. And probably there's nobody looking at this video that doesn't have some aspect of wear and tear in their major joints. Hip joints, for example, lower backs would be examples where wear and tear often occurs. And from an acupuncture point of view, from the earliest era, there has been a distinction, a very definite distinction between these two types of arthropathies. So let's look at them. So if there is heat invasion, what are the characteristics? Very often it's the smaller joints that are affected. Very often the pain will jump from one joint to the next joint. A typical example might be the joints on the fingers, and that is the typical example of the presentation, the initial presentation anyway, of rheumatoid arthritis, where bony joints can become painful, then the pain subsides, and the joint beside it might become painful then. So there's this constant rolling activity of pain and often heat as well. So therefore putting your hands in hot water would be a painful experience. So this is a typical example of heat invasion of the smaller joints. It's very common. I mean, eventually, of course, it progresses without treatment, and one gets the classic example of rheumatoid arthritis of the hands, where there might be a swan neck deformity of the hand, ulnar deviation and telescoping of one joint into the next, leading to eventual loss of complete function of a hand, and that is not uncommon in rheumatoid arthritis. So it's an inflammatory condition with all the signs of heat. There may or may not be the presence of damp as well. Often there is, because the joints are often swollen. You often get hot swelling of the joints. Again, it comes and goes because heat comes and goes. That's the nature of heat, to come and go. And of course, adding heat to heat is a very bad thing to do and will only make the problem much worse. And the person will tell you that themselves, because by putting their hand into a dish of hot water, say to wash up or whatever, is only going to make matters a lot worse. So by and large, heat invasion is something associated with the smaller joints, but not always. The larger joints in the spine, for example, might become victim of ankylosing spondylitis. And of course, the use of the word itis implies heat. And these are the larger joints that eventually can be destroyed to a greater or a lesser extent, giving deformity. And that deformity could sometimes be described as a poker spine, where the person is abnormally rigid, or alternatively and more commonly bent over. And that very often is the terminal end of ankylosing spondylitis. Heat doesn't last forever, and eventually these conditions burn out. In other words, you're left with joints that are perhaps painless now, but lacking in function. And that's often the terminal end of heat invasion of these joints, be it the large joints such as ankylosing spondylitis or the smaller joints such as rheumatoid arthritis. But one way or the other, from an acupuncture point of view, it is heat invasion, often with damp as well. Sometimes, and it's something not to be fooled by, sometimes the smaller joints can actually have cold invasion, but cold invasion is often associated with the larger joints. Very often will correspond to what is described as wear and tear, the crumbling away of a joint, perhaps due to overuse. Perhaps somebody who might be very heavy is putting a lot of pressure under hip joints, and hip joints may fail. In other words, they may rub together, the acetabulum and the head of the major bone, the femur, may rub off each other, creating a wear and tear, a pockmarking of the bone, creating a crumbling away of calcium, creating pain. And the characteristic of this pain is completely different. It's pain that's fairly constant. It doesn't come and go. It's first first thing you notice in the morning and last thing you notice at night, and it's a constant dull ache. And eventually most people are listed for hip replacements. It's a long, drawn-out process, usually due to perhaps the person is a little bit overweight, putting too much pressure on a hip joint. But other joints can be affected as well, knees very, very commonly, also ankles. And these are points that benefit, or joints that benefit by the addition of heat, because of course it's cold invasion from an acupuncture way of looking at it. So heat will be a benefit to the person. And it's a very, very, very different situation, of course, than the heat invasion that we refer to for the smaller joints. But just as sometimes bigger joints like the lumbar vertebrae can be affected by heat as an ankylosing spondylitis, the smaller joints as well can be affected by cold. It's not very common, but it can happen. I often find people with psoriatic arthropathy, for example, that's the arthritis associated with psoriasis. A small joint, a finger joint, could be affected, and very often that's cold invasion. Again, not always, but very often it tends to be. And as I said, the bigger joints can be affected by heat invasion as well. Another small joint that's often affected by heat invasion is your toe. I'm referring to gout. Gout can be an enormously painful experience and is often in one's big toe, and that very often is a heat invasion. But again, it falls into the pattern of small joints and heat and the coming and going and the unpredictability of the actual pain, as opposed to the predictability of cold invasion, which of course, as I said, is a constant dull ache that's there all of the time. So the treatments are completely and totally different. With rheumatoid arthritis, otherwise from our point of view known as heat invasion, with or without damp of the joint, very useful points are the back sheep points. These are points related to the knuckles to take heat directly out. Take heat out of the body as well. That's a useful thing to do with the standard points like large intestine 4, large intestine 11, Sanja number 6, for example, would be good points to use. But very often you need locally to take the pain out, and the back sheep points tend to be very good to do that. They can be distal or they can be proximal to the knuckles, and just needle in there as close as you can, and again the area around the needle will blush up as heat is released. For the bigger joints, for example hip, you have to put heat in, and the best way is to needle in. Maybe gallbladder 30 would be a very good example. But people who have hip, I suppose, issues, cold invasion of the hip, that is, wear and tear, tend to be quite heavy people, and the needle has to travel quite a distance to get in there towards the actual joint itself, towards the acetabulum. And when that happens, the travel distance for heat along the needle is going to be quite a distance. So it's a challenge to put heat into these situations, but that's what one does. You position the person lying on their side with one leg folded over the other to bring the greater trochanter out as near to the surface as you possibly can, so that the needle has as a minimum travel distance, but still on many people it can be quite a distance. So you do the best you can to apply heat into that area. I often find electroacupuncture can be helpful as well, for the very simple reason, wherever you have calcium flakes and associated with wear and tear, you probably have interference and paralysis of the local muscles that go into a spastic contraction. So anything that restores the muscles to their original normality is a very, very helpful thing to do. So therefore, two separate conditions really that have very, very little in common. Heat invasion, which generally are the small joints often associated with rheumatoid arthritis, or the other smaller arthropathies associated with heat. And of course, the larger joints associated with cold invasion, which is generally corresponds to wear and tear. Thank you.